a particular patient. And we have to look at the moral distress issue. You're hearing it now. We heard it in New York, and you're hearing it now when you hear nurses and doctors from hospitals in California and Texas and Arizona and Florida talk about how exhausted they are, how distressing it is to see the amount of death that they're seeing, and to have to try to be family as well as medical caretaker when they're already overburdened. The hospital administration, who are trying to deal with the shortages, and of course, patients and families. The moral distress from this is enormous, and we're going to have a whole lot of PTSD in families who have suffered a loss, in physicians and nurses. There's going to be a lot of stuff to deal with even when the medical situation has improved. And if we go back to the concept, Kant's concept that what matters is the willingness to act for the good of others, even at the risk of personal loss, makes us question, is it ethical for political leaders to put their perceived political fortunes over the health of the citizens they represent? Do our leaders have an ethical duty to protect citizens with testing, contact tracing, financial support so that people are not going bankrupt because they got COVID, and a guarantee of care? This is a very present issue because there is a battle going on right now where the administration wants to defund, take all federal funds out of testing and contact tracing. And Congress, even Republicans in Congress, are not happy with that approach. Somebody's going to win on that, and hopefully it will be the forces that want testing and contact tracing and financial support. And just a note about high holidays, which we're all thinking about. There was a choir in Washington State where they got together for choir practice. People were told not to come if they were sick. Somebody came with a sniffle, and 82% of the people present were positive for COVID in the week or two after this. We're not going to see singing in the synagogue, choirs singing in the synagogue. And imagine how many droplets blowing a shofar will spread. So a lot of this is going to be virtual this year because saving a life, pikuach nefesh, is our most central mitzvah. And now that I have presented you with all sorts of unanswerable questions, I'm going to give it to the rabbi to answer them with Jewish sources.
Actually, I'm going to do the classical Jewish thing, which is to simply give you more questions, to muddy the waters, and to basically try to lay out the many complexities from the standpoint of Jewish bioethical treatments. And there are, as we will see, a variety of different approaches that take place. What I'm going to do in a moment is share my screen. Bear with me a second.
As you're doing that, I want to say I just put it in the chat box, but we had intended to record this because some people had asked to see the recording afterward. I forgot to push record right at the beginning, so I did that about 5 minutes ago or so. So I'm sorry that we missed a good chunk of the first part, but we are recording now, and we'll record to the end, and we'll share it out afterwards as well.
Well, that's good. They won't hear my Cassandra voice of doom part of the talk.
Oh, well, they missed important pieces, but some of it may come back in the question and answer, et cetera.
Yeah, we've been talking about this since March, and I have felt all along that here I am, I'm the voice of doom. I'm talking about how things are going to get worse. Unfortunately, everything we predicted back then happened. And I'll stop talking.
Somebody just asked whether you might be able to share your PowerPoint with us afterwards. I'm not sure. Yes, okay.
The only issue is that although they are segued one into the other, we work independently on our elements of the presentation. So we would need to send you actually something that combines ours.
Sure,
So,
however you send it is okay with us.
okay. Okie doke. Well, can everybody see my screen? It says Jewish sources. Excellent. And surprisingly enough, I'm going to talk about Jewish sources. No bait and switch here. And the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the question of the responsibility of government leaders. There's a basic principle in Jewish relations to the dominant society, and the principle is Dina de Malkuta Dina. The law of the land takes precedence over Jewish law, except in specific situations. But in the case of something such as COVID, we have to rely on the leadership at the national level or the absence thereof. Hence, what I'm going to be beginning with is a position taken by, and some of you may remember him, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, who is the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel for seemingly forever. In 1983, he wrote, "The government may not excuse itself from its responsibility toward the sick, since the government is responsible for the health of the people." And as is no surprise, this assertion is consistent with the Jewish law, which insists that the community, through its leaders, take responsibility for the health and welfare of its members. So much so, in fact, that a community, even going back many, many generations historically, had the right to input as to the acceptability of a leader, or as we would say in modern parlance, the community can vote. And we are witness in this present age to the kind of competent national leadership that has created for very low to nil cases of COVID in countries around the world. Vietnam, a country of 97 million people, as well as New Zealand, are countries in which there are currently no cases of COVID-19 because of the quick and well-organized manner in which national leadership addressed the crisis. Would that we had that for ourselves. So, what do Jewish sources have to tell us about dealing with a quarantine, with a pandemic? And a couple of months back, those of you who are conversant in the weekly Torah portion will remember from the portion, usually combined Tazri and Metzora, that Leviticus 13 and 14 not only understands that quarantine should be used, but in fact offers very specific ways in which quarantine should be used to contain contagious diseases. Now, the problem when it comes to the issue of medical triage, which is what we are talking about today, is that historically ancient and medieval medicine had limited curative capabilities. And because of that, Jewish sources of that time did not speak of medical triage. Our sources did, however, speak of triage in other arenas, and those are quite instructive. For example, ancient and medieval decisors spoke of triage concerning poverty and concerning the redemption of captives. And as we'll see, this will be quite instructive concerning medical triage. For example, if a member of your family is kidnapped and needs to be redeemed, you, the members of the immediate family, are obligated by Jewish law to use all of your resources to redeem that individual. The problem is what happens when you exhaust all of your resources and you're dealing with a foe that does not accept what you can offer as sufficient. and requires you to then turn to the wider community. The wider community is responsible to be engaged in the process of redemption of captives. However, because of the welfare of the community taking precedence over the welfare of any individual or individual family, our community can set limits as to what it will provide to redeem a captive so as to not impoverish itself. In fact, if an enemy demands that a community turn over a specific person, or else the entire community will be put to death, and there are cases of that having been of topic of discussion, some rabbinic sources say that a person can be given over to safeguard the community. And this is because Judaism subscribes to a communitarian ethic. Or as that great Jewish scholar Spock says, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Nevertheless, a cardinal rabbinic principle is that one life may not be sacrificed for another. That's the underlying place in Jewish discussions such as the one that we are engaged in. So let's talk about what Jewish sources have to say. As we enter the modern era, we do in fact see halachic literature beginning to address the question of allocation of scarce medical resources. Most important of these responsa is an 18th century responsa or response by Rabbi Yosef ben Meir Tomim, who established a general principle of medical triage in Jewish law. And I quote, "If there are two patients, one in greater need than the other, the resources sufficient for only one of them, then the patient in certain danger has priority over one in possible danger." And this principle is cited and applied over and over again to bioethical scenarios by 20th century Orthodox poskim or decisors, most specifically Moshe Feinstein, Shlomo Auerbach, and Menashe Klein. Now, if you go through all of the halachic responsa, we will see that, at least from the standpoint of someone not too far from you, 5 principles might be adduced. And these are from Rabbi Elliot Dorff. Rabbi Dorff adduces 5 principles whereby we might choose. And they play themselves out, as we will see, in the specific responsa of our various decisors. And what's interesting is that although Rabbi Dorff, who is seen as the dean of modern Jewish bioethics in the conservative movement, there are rejoinders by his friend and colleague, Daniel Nevis, who is on the East Coast. He is a Jewish theological seminary in New York, whereas Rabbi Dorff is around the corner from you at the University of Judaism in LA. And Rabbi Dorff offers 5 principles that should be tossed into the pot for our consideration. The first, and this is a very important and actually very consistent principle, is that of concentric circles. First, you concern yourself with yourself, then your immediate family, then your extended family, then your local Jewish community, and then the larger Jewish community. And finally, you look to the needs of people of other faiths throughout the world. And if you're looking for a basis for this, for a, you might say a warrant, the most or best known is that of Hillel: "If I am not for myself, who will be for me?" But immediately the response, "But if I am only for myself, who am I?" Or, as it's played out in a more intricate rabbinic response, this is from the Talmud in Tractate Bava Metzia. It's a well-known story of 2 who are on the road. One of them has and owns a bottle of water. And we are told that if both of them drink, they will both die. After a bit of rabbinic discussion, Rabbi Akiba emerges ascendant, and he says that one with the bottle should keep it for himself, for it is for the benefit of the community that one rather than none survives. Hence, what we're seeing here is a utilitarian approach. Now, it goes a bit further to say that if in fact there is no possibility of them both surviving, then you turn to an approach whereby you equally share the water because they are both going to die, and you want to have both being given as much support as possible up to the time that they will die. So that is principle number one. And you might ask how this concentric circle model plays out in the pandemic. And it's fairly straightforward. First, you keep yourself healthy. Then you concern yourself with your immediate family. And of course, if you wear a mask and if you maintain quarantine, if you've been away for 14 days, then you are doing what you ought to do. Then beyond that, you help Jewish institutions that are suffering financially, both locally and nationally. And one of the things that I'm heartened to see that there are congregations where there have been, in fact, a boosting of financial support to synagogues, knowing that there are some people who have lost their jobs, and as a result, people of means have been pumping money into their congregations, into their local and national federations in order to make up the shortfall. And last of all, working to protect all people through competent national leadership. As synagogues, we may not take positions about who to vote for, but we can certainly talk about within our 501c3 warrants what is appropriate social and political positions to be taken that are in accord with Jewish legal principles. We turn now to a second principle that is derived from Rabbi Dorff's discussions and is the one of social hierarchy. We are instructed to save those who are most important in society. Now, as we're going to see, this plays out in some cases against and in fact put down by other principles. But according to this one independent principle, you are to care for the most important in society, meaning members of the priesthood or the ones who know the most Torah. This is so important a principle that we find the principle that a knowledgeable mamzer, that is to say a Jewish person who is born to an illicit or illegal relationship, takes precedence even over an ignorant priest. Now the question is, how might this principle be applied during this pandemic? And it can be fairly quick to see that this might be turned to the question of first responders, particularly to doctors and to nurses and to those who are involved in providing medical care. We'll talk more about that. A third principle, the hierarchy of social responsibilities. First, you redeem captives, that is to say, people who are outside of your immediate community. Then, once your community is intact, then you turn to the sick among the poor, then feeding the poor, then clothing the poor, then providing for Jewish education, and then building and supporting the synagogue. And note here that the preservation of life takes precedence over all. A fourth principle, the greatest needs of the individuals at risk, which we're going to see played out over and over again. Save those whose lives are directly at risk first, then turning to those whose lives are at lesser risk, and finally turning to those who are at risk for physical harm. Now, this is addressed in Shulchan Aruch concerning those who are being tortured or raped, but we'll see how that can be applied in broader circumstances. And finally, a fifth principle, everyone is equal. Here, the idea is that all are created in the image of God, and ultimately, our lives belong not to us, but to God. Now, all of the following decisors, the modern and contemporary scholars, as we're going to see, have very opposing opinions in some case, but all of them nonetheless are guided by utilitarian principles. The problem arises when it is impossible to triage based solely on utilitarian concerns. So let's look at perhaps the dean of poskim, perhaps the most important of our Orthodox rabbinic decisors. And Moshe Feinstein says, to heal or to save a person's life, it makes absolutely no difference whether a person is young or old, regardless of whether they are of high station or low. With regard to them, it is the obligation to standard therapy, and with regard to priority in treatment, or to put it in a single phrase, first come, first served, and if needs be, he will tell us, even a lottery and nothing else can come into play. Why? As he tells us, because all human lives are of infinite value, and because of that, we are not in a position to judge which soul is of greater value than another soul. And yet, in distinction, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg maintains that one can even withhold life-saving equipment from a patient who is not expected to live, in anticipation of the arrival of a patient, not a patient who's present, but the arrival of a patient with a better prognosis, meaning that here you are in an ER and you're going to be shunting people to your ICUs and to your COVID units, and yet you have been called by an ambulance and you have an EMT telling you that you have someone who has a really good prognosis, but they're going to need whatever kind of resources from a COVID unit, whether it be a respirator or ventilator or something of that sort. And that person who's not even at the door of your hospital, nonetheless, according to Rabbi Waldenberg, takes precedence over someone who is in your ICU, but who is not expected to live. That sounds like something that would go in violation of Jewish law, but according to Waldenberg, absolutely not. Then we have Rabbi Emanuel Rackman, who's of the opinion when one must choose between two persons concerning who will live and who will die, the decision must be based on that of the person who will act on that decision, not on an ethics committee, not on a hospital board, not on state directive, not on any agent separate from the individual, him or herself. It is that doc looking in the face of that individual who must make that decision. And we'll see that echoes the writings of Emmanuel Levinas, one of our great ethical decisors. Let's keep going. In distinction to Rabbi Rackman, Rabbi Feinstein rejoins that if two pet people arrive simultaneously, again, doctors have no discretion to choose who should live, because doctors have no basis for deciding whose life is more worthy. All souls are of infinite value. Again, he tells us we should rely on a lottery or a first come, first served system. Bottom line, he says, chance. Because in chance, you might say, following something along the lines of Adam Smith, it is the invisible finger of God that is present, that is making that decision for you. Here's where we become, as Jews, fatalists. Rabbi Walter Wurzburger, however, disagrees with both of the above, and he maintains that some rational system of priority should be advised rather than consorting to random selection of patients. In fact, what he is suggesting is that social worth should play a role in the decision, a position that we have seen is vigorously opposed by Rabbi Feinstein. So what we're seeing is, even though there are certain guiding principles that apply in Jewish bioethics, and particularly among Orthodox and even ultra-Orthodox rabbinic poskim, even there are countervailing views that obtain. So it doesn't help us solve our problem unless you are coming out of a specific Jewish community that tends toward the decisions of one or another of these poskim. And a bottom line, if you are a traditional or even not a traditional doctor, what your rabbi tells you to do, or even if you had to constitute a bet din, what your bet din tells you, as they in turn are guided by all of these different halakhic views. It has one's mind spinning. And let's just add a little more complexity. While Rabbi Moshe Tendler agrees with Rabbi Feinstein that human life is of infinite value and cannot be prioritized objectively, he also recognizes that the practical needs of society may require that some people be given priority. That is, for example, physicians and skilled nurses in the midst of a pandemic, meaning, let us say you are in a community where there is one ER doc, one ICU doc who is competent to handle COVID, one respiratory care technician and nurse, and without them, your community is up against the maelstrom. And according to Tendler, then you have the right to put the priority of your physicians and skilled nurses first in order, completely in opposition to what Rabbi Feinstein said. And here you can see underlying this the notion of a communitarian view. That as a covenantal community, we concern ourselves with the community as a whole, because our covenant with God is not as individuals, but as a community. And hence the community takes precedence over any single individual. Your head spinning? Let's keep going. And let's see how all of this has been tossed into the pot in modern Israel. A couple of months back, addressing issues exactly such as this, the Israel Medical Association's Ethics Board met, and the end result is a position written by Dr. Tommy Carney, who's the head of the Ethics Board. And this is what she writes. In the current situation, we will want to save as many patients who have a chance to survive, and we will be forced not to waste any resources on those who can't be saved. Moreover, we have decided that a physician can't be a party to a decision about budgeting resources based on non-medical criteria, such as age, gender, religion, race, economic, or social status, and by implication, of course, whether their status is that of a physician or a primary care responder. According to Dr. Tommy Carney and the Israel Medical Association's guidelines that have been issued for all doctors in Israel, save for those who turn, if they are Orthodox doctors, who turn to the rabbis or the Batei Din, doctors are instructed to consider only medical criteria in the sorting of patients, which takes us then to the existential concern, what are we to do? And I leave you with an abstraction which really does obtain. And it's of sorts related to the question of where is God in this pandemic? And the answer is, according to the Jewish philosopher of ethics, Emmanuel Levinas, God is in the face of the other. And if you are a caregiver, it is the infinite claim of the individual whose Face is that of the capital other, in which the presence of God resides, that has an infinite claim on you in that moment. How that plays out, it depends on who you are and what informs you in terms of your training as a physician, as a Jew or as a non-Jew. Whatever ethical considerations have been part of your armamentarium as you have entered into a situation where you look upon a patient and must decide. Which takes us to the question we now raise of you. What do you think?
Okay, so why don't we start with the question of who gets the scarce resource? Do you think a lottery is appropriate? Do you think social value to the community should be something that we consider? Do the Torah scholars, the rabbis, get first priority for the scarce resource? Do the doctors and nurses? What do you think we should do? You can either raise your physical hand, or if you go to participants, there's a little raise hand thing you can click. Tell us what you think we should do.
Do you want me to call on people, or are you going to?
It's sometimes I miss people. I don't realize somebody's got their hand up, but it looks like Terry does.
But I'm often hovering in the background, checking out whether you're awake, whether your hand's raised, what you're eating, if you're still on the treadmill, whatever's going on.
Okay, fantastic presentation. It shows again 3 Jews, 8 opinions, just like the Talmud does throughout. You could find any opinion you want, which always encourages discussion. I've always been thinking about when people are super, super sick, besides the COVID, just always, how many resources does society spend on somebody who's just not going to recover? We all know that like the last 3 months of life, it takes, I forget, 60% of our national medical bills. It's just tremendous. But so these questions are, I think, also apply to the broader picture of at what point do you just let the person go?
And
Answer?
in fact, Jewish law is actually quite directive in providing several different categories of status of people as they move toward their demise. And actually, Carol, I'm going to let you address this because it's going to roll over into some of the other more bioethical considerations.
Yeah, but first, Terry, I'd like to know what your solution is. What's your answer?
It's very tough. I liked the point of I don't remember which philosopher doctor said. You look at what is the possibility of recovery. Who has the likelihood to survive? If you have the luxury of valuing somebody by whatever criteria, that's another step. But first, if someone's just totally, like in the military, or like we learn in emergency first aid, you've got to go to the people who have a chance to survive first. If someone's just about gone, you just red tag them and move on because they're not going to survive. But it's tough.
Normally, in an ICU, you would, even if someone, as they did not have a do not resuscitate order, even if they are critically ill and have a small chance of survival, you would resuscitate because maybe they really do have a chance, even if it's small. With COVID, that resuscitation produces aerosol, no matter how carefully you do it. And the question with COVID is, things we would normally do, is it reasonable to not do them because of risk to the staff? So thoughts on that? Yeah, Julie, you may have to unmute yourself.
there we go. It seems to me that the prime thing is to keep those who can live living. And whatever that means to the process, that's what we ought to aim for.
Even if resuscitating that person and giving them that chance, even though it's really unlikely that they're going to survive, puts the staff at much higher risk.
You don't want to resuscitate, again, because you want those most able to survive. And if you kill off all the helpers, nobody's going to survive.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see, Herb had his hand raised.
And then Ellen Ellis was having trouble with the hand raise feature. So you can add Ellen to the.
Okay.
Thanks.
She needs an orthopod.
Okay, I've got, no, I think you're gonna have to unmute yourself, Herb.
Go ahead, Herb.
Excuse me, you now can hear me.
Yes.
The presentation, which was very thoughtful and very well researched, focused to a great deal on the writings of conservative and the speaking of conservative and Orthodox rabbis. We are, of course, a Reform congregation. And I was wondering whether Rabbi Greninger might identify some areas, if there are any, where Reform Judaism takes a different point of view. Now, I realize I'm asking you, Rabbi, to do something almost impossible, but I think it would be very helpful if there are one or two things that are different to help us all deal with this imponderable and unanswerable question.
I'm going to turn that, actually, Rabbi Gerson is a Reform rabbi, and so he can probably share even better than I can. And also say that at least one of the sources that he gave is from the conservative movement as well. So they were not all Orthodox rabbis.
Thank you, Rabbi Greninger. The principles that I shared with you, which are derived primarily from Elliot Dorff, reflect the conservative movement. And for that matter, they are very important for us Reform rabbis because we tend not to focus on responses to the degree the conservative movement does. We are more interested in praxis than pure intellectual discussion, although we certainly have decisions being made. But in some ways, it's reinventing the wheel because Elliot, who works very closely with Reform rabbis, and for that matter, Daniel Nevis, provide us resources up and back. As many of you may be aware, the Reform movement, the conservative movement over the last 30 years have come closer and closer together in general stance. There's nothing in the principles that Elliot or Daniel adduced that you would find any Reform rabbi saying, I've got entirely different principles. We all look to Jewish text to see what it says to us, to guide us, but then we look at individual situations and ask, how might this be applied in the existential? If you would say, what is the great difference between a position such as might be taken by Feinstein or Tendler or Rackman or one of the others, I would say that we would be, first of all, asked by Levinas to look into the face of the physician that we are speaking to who seeks our counsel and to be fully present in a semi-Buberian way. And likewise, for that physician to muster up their soul presence as they stand before a patient as they then bring everything else into play, all of their medical knowledge, their knowledge of what resources are available to them, what are the PPE, what are the devices, all of that then comes into play.
And I would add to that, that the really big difference between the Orthodox community and the Reform community is that in the Orthodox community, someone may go to the Rebbe and say, tell me what to do. Tell me what I have to do.
And the
Whereas-
rabbi will then tell you, and that's what you do. But
Right.
not so, but you know, Reform rabbis, the only thing we can tell you to do is to pay your dues and contribute to your Yom Kippur appeal.
No, the Reform rabbi will say to you, this is what tradition says.
Right.
You can take that into account in determining what is appropriate for your family to do.
Example.
That, I would say, is the biggest difference.
Example. Although Orthodox rabbis will be very much aware what other Orthodox rabbis are saying, they're going to tell you what to do. You talk to an Orthodox rabbi, he will tell you what to do. You talk to a conservative or a Reconstructionist or Reform rabbi, if they are worth their salt, they will tell you what I just told you, which is all of the possibilities, and then will engage with you in a Buberian or Levinasian way to try to help you make a decision that your soul can live with and that the person you're counseling can live with.
And you had asked me to mention the concept of a goses, which is, even within traditional Jewish practice, a goses is a person who is within traditionally 3 days of death. And when someone becomes a goses, you are no longer obligated to do everything to preserve that life. You are not to get in the way of the process of the natural process of death.
Actually, Carol, let me put in something as a kind of meta level. One of the things that's interesting in Jewish decision-making and such things is Judaism is not a tradition of this is what you do. We're a tradition of continua. For example, you know, is a fetus a living, breathing person? And the answer is up until the moment that its head emerges or 2/3 of the trunk, it is not a nephesh. It is not a living human being. But even there are stages up to 30 days after birth where that child is not fully attained to being a fully ensouled living human being. At the other end of the life cycle, you have the same thing when it comes to approaching death. There's a stage before goses, then there's goses. And these are stages even internal to that where you are on a continuum up to the point of where the last breath leaves the nostrils or the heart stops beating, or both.
I'll just add, when I had learned about goses, the phrase that really stuck with me is what's called actively dying. And that once somebody has started actively dying, in Jewish tradition, we view it that it's actually forbidden to interfere with that process in any way to try to prevent it from happening. Now there's, you know, the questions of how do you know you've entered into that stage, which is both a Jewish and ethical question as well as a medical question. But it's this process of there is a point at which you do stop intervening, and figuring out when to do that is the question.
Yeah, the notion of miraculous cure. We as Jews do not rely on miracles, period. It is not a Jewish thing. So somebody's on their deathbed, they can barely breathe. You don't, say, dear, fill in the blank, heal this soul. You don't do that.
Now, Ellen had a question or a comment.
So I was mistaken. She does not. I just see Marlene's hand.
Okay, Marlene. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I know. I was
Right.
trying to, my cursor didn't move. I have a question, not really away from Judaism, but really looking at the criteria. When you take a criteria, for example, like social value, well, I mean, social value is very controversial. Who has the greatest social value and who decides? And so there's a lot of criteria like that. You know, for example, doctors looking at patients, they may think they know who's going to be the best person to get the medical treatment, but it may not necessarily be true. So, I mean, it's like a catch-22 dilemma that we just can't possibly solve. Who has the greatest social value? Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask a politician, well, of course, they're going to say they have the greatest social value. Mothers have the greatest social value. Fathers, I mean, there's no answer to these questions. So I think it's kind of like a straw man that you put up, or that we put up as, you know, a society, because it's kind of like passing the buck. I mean,
Well, Marlene, when it comes to most issues of social value, I would agree with you. Do you also think that applies when, of your 3 ICU doctors, one of them is among the very sick with COVID patients, and you don't have enough remdesivir to treat all 3 patients who would be appropriate for it? Do you think it would be appropriate then to treat the doctor, because of that person's social value to the community and helping save other sick people?
I can't answer that question because I don't know this doctor. I have no idea. I mean, this may be a doctor who has goodwill, but he may not be a very good doctor. So I may want to say, I want that for only good doctors. So what is the definition of good doctors? I mean, it's just a never-ending cycle that there's no answer for.
But you're now the ICU doc and you have to decide who gets the drug. What are you going to do?
I have no idea.
You're going to use the lottery?
No lottery. No, lotteries, I think, well, I'm not partial to lotteries, but.
Well, if you've got 3 patients and you've got one course of a drug that may help them, and somehow you're going to have to decide. And I realize these questions are extraordinarily difficult. The reason I'm pushing you on them is because this is what people are facing right now in emergency rooms and in ICUs. Physicians are having to make decisions that are impossible decisions. So you've got 1 dose, you got to give it to one of 3 people. Now, you don't want to use the issue of social value. You don't want a lottery. Are you going to use age as a criteria? As a criterion?
I can't solve this problem.
Yeah.
I'm going to withdraw because I'm just setting up, you know, what I feel that we're all faced with. And there's no good answer to any question.
Howard has his hand raised, and
Yes.
Herb also.
Okay, Howard.
And Herb, how about you?
I don't know how to raise my hand.
Yes, I just wanted to bring up another conundrum, is that in San Quentin prison, we have many people on death row, as well as other inmates who are infected. So you have people who are on death row, and we have limited resources. So I'm just throwing this out. I don't have an opinion strongly to say yes, yay or nay, but if we're going to triage our resources, do we consider that someone's in prison? Do we consider then that that person has been condemned to death in allotting our resources?
Well, we know what Rabbi Feinstein would say. Rabbi Feinstein would say every human life is of equal value. You can't deprive one person based on whatever reason, even that someone has been convicted of crime. So what do the rest of you think? We don't all agree with Rabbi Feinstein. Do you think the patient who is sitting on death row should have equal access to a ventilator, an ICU, a drug?
Carol and Howard.
So
And
I'm
then we also have a
nurse,
question from
nurse
Carol.
practitioner, and I used to work on a transplant floor, and we actually would
Oh, man.
give the people from San Quentin kidney transplants. They'd come in with their ball and chain. We'd have to weigh them with their ball and chain and everything. I had a real ethical dilemma about them getting it, but it's true. You know, they get it just like we do. My feeling is with those 3 patients, you see who's the sickest, you see who's the oldest, you see who has comorbidities. I mean, you have to weigh everything, right? To find out who is the best candidate to get the one medication.
Okay.
Howard.
And then there was another Carol. There were 2 Carols. So
Yes.
Carol Ogan.
Are you unmuted?
Howard Shaw.
Well, Carol Ogan had a question from a while ago.
I did. My question, when you talked about someone dying, what about the adage, where there's life, there's hope? How do you address that?
Rabbi?
That it's a lovely adage, but when it comes to the actual issue, we don't wait for hope, because if that were the case, you'd never take anybody off of any ventilator or off of any life-sustaining element, even if all medical advice says this is a brain-dead person who voted for someone whose name shall not be mentioned.
Actually, there is Orthodox Judaism does not accept brain death. The very Orthodox do not accept brain death. They go by traditional cardiovascular, the ceasing of cardiovascular function is
Or
the
breath.
measure of death.
Or breath.
So brain death is not acceptable. However, there's potential fudging, because you're not allowed to remove the ventilator. But if you happen to have disconnected it to do some suctioning, then maybe since it's not connected, it's not the same as actively removing it with the intention of causing death. So even there can be stretching of criteria to a particular situation.
In fact, there's
Yeah.
even at this point, there are post-scheme who are looking at the body as a holistic system, and by virtue of that are pushing the envelope on those things, even independent of the legal fiction that you're mentioning, Carol. Not yet mainstream, but it's gnawing even in the Orthodox community to move toward brain death.
Now, we don't have to end the discussion, but before, I don't want to forget first to give my plug that if there is anybody here who does not have an advance directive, I suspect most of you do, but if you don't, this is the time to make sure you have one. And even more important than the actual written document is having the conversation with the people closest to you, who would be the people making decisions for you if you can't make them for yourself. It is a gift to those people to take the burden off them by telling them what your values are and what you would want if you were in a position where you can't make decisions for yourself. And for many of us who are older, it is not just you that needs it. Your children, your adult children need it. Everybody from teenagers on need to have that discussion Because if you think of every case that you've heard about that made law when it comes to end of life decisions, none of those people were old. It was Karen Quinlan and Nancy Cruzan and Olivia Bouvier and Terry Schiavo more recently. They were all young people who did not leave home that day and say, I think today is the day something will happen to me, so maybe I should have an advance directive today. And especially with the majority of cases, 70% of the cases in California are young people. And they're going to be more because they're not following guidelines as well as older people. So advanced directives, there is a really easily downloadable form from the web that's either called a POLST or a MOLST, Physician's Order for Life-Sustaining Treatment or Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It's one page and it's easy and quick to fill out. There are many more complicated forms that allow you to be very specific. 5 wishes is one that we particularly like. And that's a bigger deal to fill out. But the MOLST or POLST form is one that you can easily download, print it in a brightly colored piece of paper, bright pink, bright orange. Paramedics know to look for those forms and they look for them on the refrigerator. But also, if you have a form, it's sitting in a desk drawer in your house or in a safety deposit box does not help if nobody knows where it is. So if you have a form, make sure the people who are going to be making decisions for you know where that form is and have a copy. And if you have a particular primary care provider or hospital that you use, make sure they have a copy.
So I'm noticing we have maybe 5 more minutes in this time, and I think we have, I see Herb has a question. I'm not sure if others do.
Marlene, did you have another one? Okay, yeah, Herb. Oh, Herb, you're muted.
Relative to Marlene's question, I think when you get to that point with the doctor at the point of decision making, that's where you think about the faith, confidence, and trust you have in your whole health system. And that bothers me a little in ours. Because at that point, I think, we are depending on the individual. The last thing we want them to do is to spend an hour thinking, because the person will probably be gone. And so it's the place where our ethics say we have to have confidence in earlier decisions we've made at this point of no return. This point of...
Yep. Does that make you think then that having an institutional policy on these that doctors can fall back on when they have to make a tough decision like that having that institutional policy is a benefit, so that some of the agony of making those decisions is removed from the physician, and so that people who have really thought about all of these questions and all of the different things that weigh on those answers, that those people together come to a policy that people agree upon and then the hospital can use on who do we not resuscitate. When we don't have enough of a scarce resource, who gets it? What about that, having a policy, having a committee come to a...
I think having a policy would go along with my point that the doctor would then be better informed. As long as that policy did not come from the hospital lawyer or the risk committee that is trying to protect the hospital from being sued. And I think we really have to separate these issues from the very practical. I'm not saying the hospital should not have these kinds of committees, but they should not make the ethical decisions for the hospital.
Okay. Lori, did you want to say something?
This may be the
Yeah.
last question for
Want to unmute
Lori.
yourself?
Me, Lori?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually do, because I'm back in the emergency room, okay? I'm not no, I'm not back right now. All right, this is important to note. But who makes the determination? As someone who's medically dependent, who makes the determination of my life being worth saving? The last hospitalist I had didn't think that I had a good quality of life. I had to educate him. So who decides my quality of life?
Yeah.
Which
So
takes,
when there's a tough decision, what are you comfortable with? If there's not enough to go around, are you comfortable with a lottery? First come, first serve? How do you think those decisions should be made?
I really have struggled. I don't know.
I'd like to raise something that, Lori, your comment probes. And it's the question of who is the doc. It's not as simple as a doctor. Choose a doctor who is a Hindu. I lived in India for a while, and actually Carol and I were there just a few months ago. And talking to bioethicists there, among the things that, that you learn is that because of the notion of karma being so central to the Hindu ethos, the notion of somebody with disability, the society doesn't concern itself because it's foreordained by virtue of whatever they did in a prior life. So that's a consideration. Or a consideration of someone, the question that Carol and Ken had raised about, well, there's always hope. If you have a doctor who's an evangelical and believes that there can be, a miracle last minute, that doctor may not be willing to make a decision that is from our standpoint, to the benefit of the family or even of the patient. So all of these are considerations that need to be thrown into the pot, into the cauldron. And then the question becomes one of what hospital do you go to? Who is your primary care doc? Who do you have taking you, God forbid, in an ambulance? Do you just call 911 or do you have a specific ambulance service that takes you to a hospital that's further away that you want to go to? All of these are considerations.
Well, and Dr. Gerson was saying a few minutes ago about advanced directives. One of the things that came to my mind is that on the one hand, advanced directives are critical and we want to make sure everyone has them. And in some ways, it's almost counter to what this entire conversation is about, which is that you may have spelled out certain wishes in an advanced directive, but we're talking about, a public health crisis where those wishes may or may not be able to be carried out in terms of when, the life-saving measures can be taken. It depends on all these factors of, do we have enough supplies? And then how are those decisions made, which may not only be what the individual has expressed, right? But also all of these other considerations.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I think it is about 1 o'clock, and I know this conversation is so rich and really could go on for much longer, I'm sure. This topic always raises more questions than it answers. But at the same time, what you've shared, Dr. Gerson, Rabbi Gerson, have been really, really meaningful and interesting and deep, and shows the complexity of this topic and many different ways of kind of entering into the conversation, and all of the different questions that we can be asking and should be asking. And so I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with our community, to share your expertise. We're so very grateful. So
Our pleasure. It's an honor to be with you all. Some great questions.
Yeah, and so for everyone who's on this call, we have recorded at least much of the call, if not all of it. I know one of the participants recorded it as well. So we will share out as much as we can, and I believe that we'll try to share the PowerPoints as much as we can. This is not to end the conversation. Hopefully you can see who else is on this call. So, we encourage you to keep these conversations going with each other and in our community. And again, they're really hard. There is not one clear answer that's like the right thing in any of these conversations. But that doesn't mean that we just avoid the conversation because it's hard or because there isn't a clear answer. So, so thank you all. And we hope you all have a good...
Kids get advanced directives.
Yes, yes.
And-
Get an advanced directive.
And we want you to do two things. Number one, stay healthy, and number two, vote.
Yes, sir.
Vote.
Thank you all. And we will look forward to seeing you again in future Temple
Or
Isaiah.
biennial or trip or whatever.
All of those things. So
Thanks for hosting
thank
us.
you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.